Okay, I think we're ready to get this meeting started, so we'll call this joint work session to order. So we've got a lot on the agenda today, so here's the quick plan is for Jason and Paige to go through the Baker Tilly information this morning. They brought a lot of data for everybody. We'll have on the screen here as well to go through. I'm sure it'll be like normal, very informative, ask lots of questions. Everybody, we've got five-ish new people. I'm a kind of new person on the council. So for this, so, I'm sure there will be lots of questions, and then we will break for lunch and then come back. And the plan is to kind of talk amongst ourselves on the thoughts, the plans, and what our opinions are and what our hopes are that we can come out of this year with what's going to be an interesting year with what's happening in the State House. So are we all ready to get started? If so, Jason, Paige, whoever's up, jump right in. Please use the mic if you can, because we are live streaming.
There. Okay, well, thank you for having us this morning. I'm going to start out, and I'm really just going to go through kind of a basic budget 101 because I knew there are some kind of newish people. So we'll start with the next slide. The budget process really lasts the whole year, but where it starts typically is at the net assessed value. So we need to know the value of all property in the county because that's the tax base. We need to know that tax base so we can determine what tax rates are needed to generate the property tax that we need to fund services. So in August, technically by August 1st, the county auditor certifies net assessed values to the Department of Local Government Finance. Typically that happens throughout the month of August. Then during July and October, the governmental units will prepare their budgets, go through, budget workshops, budget hearings, adopt the budgets. From November to January, the DLGF, the Department of Local Government Finance, will certify the budgets, so what you're going to spend, the property tax rates, and the property tax levies. Tax bills are prepared in April, so next month the counties will start preparing the tax bills, and they'll be due May 10th and November 10th, and when taxpayers pay the tax bills, then it gets distributed out to the taxing units within the county in June and December. So how does government fund services? There's a misconception that government funds services with only property tax. That's only one component. And yes, that's usually a large component of the funding, but there are other funding sources like local income tax. That's usually another large component. There's motor vehicle and excise taxes. So when you go to the license branch to register your vehicle or renew your plates, you're paying a vehicle excise tax. That gets distributed out to governmental entities. There's motor vehicle, highway, and local road and street distributions. That's primarily gas tax. There's wheel tax, there's riverboat wagering tax, and for municipalities, cigarette and alcohol beverage taxes. And then there's all your local fines and fees and charges for services. So again, there's multiple ways that we fund budgets. Next slide. If you're interested, this is what makes up Henry County's funding for the most part. So this is 2023 actual receipts. So you've got a third of it as property taxes at 9.4 million. Another third of it, 9.2 million, is local income tax. And then gas tax, 16%. And then you can see all the other little revenue streams that make up the rest of it. So again, primary funding here in this county at the top two is going to be local income tax and property tax. So property taxes, the tax rate is applied to each $100 of net assessed value. That's different than some of our surrounding states that have property tax in the mills, meaning they do to each $1,000 value of assessed value, but ours is per 100. So again, that's based on the net assessed value, not the gross. So the gross assessed value is the value of your property. And then after you apply deductions, abatements, et cetera, you get to that net value. That's also important to note too for taxpayers. Oftentimes when you all are talking about a property tax rate increase for one reason or another, maybe it's debt service, they immediately take that rate increase and apply it to the value of their home, the gross value. That's not the way to do it because we are lucky in Indiana. We get a lot of property tax deductions on a homestead. And people sometimes don't realize that. So again, property tax is based on net assessed value. Maximum property tax. So as a governmental entity, you are only allowed to raise up to a maximum amount. Even if you need more, you are maxed out at a certain level. And that maximum amount was determined back in the 1970s, and it's been growing by a small growth factor every year since then. I do have, some history here of at least the last 5 years. It's ranged from 4% to about 5%. In 2024 and 2025, the legislation limited you to what you could raise. That should have been around 5% in 2024 and 2025, but it was limited. And here in just a second, I'm going to talk about some further limitations that we're likely going to see. But right now, as it stands, before any legislative changes, the growth factor is based on a 6-year average of non-farm personal income, which really just means it's tied to the economy. So as the economy is doing well, we see the higher percentages like the 5%. When it's not doing so well, we can see 1, 2, 3%. So it has been on the rise, at least in the past couple of years, but now the legislature is attempting to limit that. And I want to stress this because this is another misconception. The amount of property tax that you receive doesn't have anything to do with population, property values, how much you're spending. Remember, I said it's a set amount. So when you have all this new development or housing development or more people moving in, that doesn't mean you're getting additional property tax dollars. All that's doing is driving down your tax rate. So the more value you have, it takes a lower tax rate to get your maximum dollar amount. Again, misconception, because I keep hearing, oh, we see all this development, you must be raking in all kinds of money. That's just not the case. You are maxed out as to how much money you can bring in. So the next slide, we've got some legislation that is proposed right now. Senate Bill 1, and I heard that today there may be some amendments again. But for now, Senate Bill 1 says that in 2026, you will be limited to 0 growth, no growth in your maximum levy. 2027, 1%, 2028, 2%. Then they're going to change that levy formula. And it's really a complicated formula. I didn't want to put it all on this slide, but the main point is that once we begin 2029, if this passes, the growth quotient will be limited to 3.1% to probably 4.3%, depending on the county. So there's various factors that's going to go into that formula. So you're still getting limited even after 2029. Right now, with the way it's written, Senate Bill 1, those are the losses you can expect. And what this means is because the legislation is limiting your growth, this is what you're going to miss out receiving. It's not off of what you're getting now. It's if you would have had the 5.3% growth or the 5% growth, you would have gotten, $1.1 million more in 2028. So I think that the next few years are going to be very challenging when it comes to building your budgets and trying to have balanced budgets. You might have to utilize some cash reserves to get through these years, especially when you're facing 2026 and there's 0% levy growth. That's going to be very difficult in my opinion. Next slide. So just, to show you Henry County information. So you have your maximum levy is around 11.9 million, 11.8, 11.9. And these are the funds that fall under that umbrella. So it's the general reassessment, Cume Bridge, health and park. Now, it's important to note that that 11.8 million can be allocated the way the council sees fit among these funds. Now, Cume Bridge is a rate-limited fund. So if you decide you want more levy on that fund, you'd have to reestablish the rate, but you will have to reduce levy in one of the other funds. So just note that. So if in 1 year you don't need as much levy in health, you could shift it to general. We help you kind of to make, we give you suggestions on how we think it would best suit you to allocate those levies. You do have two funds that are outside the maximum levy. So you get to levy an additional 2.5 million outside your max because you have debt service, which is a great tool for you to use to do projects and to raise dollars for capital projects. And then also the Cume Capital Development Fund, which can be used for a wide range of capital items. That fund is limited by a rate, and I believe you are at the maximum rate. It's 3.33 cents. Next slide. So, you know, the rate really is the last thing that is calculated during a budget process. You know what your maximum levy is usually towards the beginning of the process. We know how much property tax you will be allowed to raise, but the rate is something that is not determined until we get the net assessed value. And again, that might be August, September timeframe. But here we just wanted to show you what 2025 looks like. In total, even with the funds outside the max, you're levying about $14.4 million. It takes a rate of almost 63 cents on your $2.3 billion of net assessed value to generate that 14.4 million. So we don't base our budgets on a particular rate. It's the levy that is provided to us by the state, and then the rate comes at the end. It's like, okay, here's what we're allowed to raise. Now let's look at that value of property and determine what rate it takes to raise those dollars. This slide is very telling, and I wish we could have the legislature look at this because in my opinion, you know, all these increases in tax bills, for the most part, I mean, there's some exceptions. The increases in tax bills have to do with the increase in property value of your home, not increasing tax rates. Look, this chart is the same chart just about for nearly all taxing units I work with. There's a downward trend. Why is that? Because property values are increasing. In 2020, your tax rate was 81 cents. 2025, it's about 63 cents. Your tax rate has gone down over the past few years. But look, your assessed value has gone up, and there is an inverse relationship. As your assessed value goes up, your tax rate's going to go down, but you're still collecting those property tax dollars. But again, I think there's a misconception, you know, on the part of the taxpayers that, oh, my tax bill is going up because you all are overspending and you're not managing your budget and your tax rates are going up. That's not necessarily the case. It's really a matter of your property values going up, and nobody wants their tax bill to go up. But you want your property value to go up. That means that we're prospering and we've got a good economy. And when you sell your house, you're not going to sell it for what you bought it for 25 years ago. Well, you hope not. So again, there's a lot of misconceptions going around, and I think that just needs to be explained to taxpayers more. Circuit breaker tax credits, unfortunately, that's another item that limits you to how much revenue you can raise. Circuit breaker tax credits limit the amount that a taxpayer pays based on their gross assessed value. So I talked a lot about net assessed value, but now I'm going to talk about gross assessed value. So basically, your tax bill is limited by a certain percentage dependent upon what type of property you have. The computed property tax bill is compared to that cap, and anything over the cap, you get a credit as a taxpayer, so you don't pay that portion. So really, that is a direct reduction in the property tax that you receive. You might be levying 500,000 or 14 million, but you're not going to receive all of that because there are credits that are returned to the taxpayers. let's go to the next slide. So there's three classifications of property tax caps. We have 1% properties, 2% properties, and 3% properties. The 1% is the residential homestead, your primary residence. That is limited to 1% of your gross assessed value. So an example, $100,000 home value, your tax bill cannot exceed $1,000 unless you have a school in your taxing district that what successfully passed a referendum to levy a rate for a project or something like that, then you're going to pay that rate in addition to the $1,000. So anything that you approve as a voter will be outside the circuit breaker caps, and you will pay that in addition to your cap. The next grouping is what we call 2% properties. That's other residential, rental, and ag land, and also long-term care facilities. That's capped at 2%. And then everything else, which is usually commercial and personal property, is capped at 3%. So this is just an example of a tax bill. Let's say you have a gross assessed value home of $200,000. Well, on that home, you're likely only paying on about $100,000 of net assessed value because of all the deductions that we get. We get a supplemental homestead deduction, a regular homestead deduction. So after all of that, you're probably only paying on, maybe $99,000. If we apply, let's say we have a district rate of 4.2380, the calculated tax bill is $4,190. But that's not what you're going to pay because you're capped at 1%. So you can't go above the 2,000. So you're going to get a credit of more than what you're going to pay, $2,190. So if we were not in a world of circuit breaker, this person would pay $4,190. But because we're limited by circuit breaker, they're only going to pay $2,000. So that $2,190 is not going to get distributed out to the taxing units. It's a reduction of your property taxes. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see how that loss or that non-collection of property tax is distributed to the taxing units. The taxing unit that has the higher tax rate is going to get a bigger share of that non-collection, that loss. So here is a real life example. Newcastle has the highest rate here in this particular taxing district. So they're going to get 30% of that loss or close to it. I'm sorry, they're going to get 53% of that loss. The school about 30%, and then the county nearly 15%. But that's how that works out. I mean, you're all in this together. You're going to get a share of the loss, but the higher the tax rate, the more loss that you're going to incur on these circuit breakers. So here is what happened in 2024. So you had a property tax levy as certified by the state of $13,698,000. However, you did not receive $1.7 million because of circuit breaker. So again, pre-circuit breaker, you would have had an extra $1.7 million to operate. But now we have to try to absorb that into our budget. That's about a 14% loss of revenue. That's not very good. I mean, I've seen worse though. I've seen 20, 25, 30% loss of revenue. What's good here is that because your assessed value has been going up, that loss has been shrinking a little bit. And I think I have that, on the next slide. So the totals are at the top. So you can see in 2024, the total that you levied, $13,699,000. The loss was 1.7, so you collected 12 million. If you look back at 2022, the loss was about almost 18%. So now you're down to 14%. So increases in assessed value help drive down circuit breakers sometimes. And it's to varying amounts, but you're collecting more now than you did in 2022, for example, because circuit breakers have gone down a little bit. So property tax values going up is a good thing, despite what taxpayers might think. Let's look at local income tax now. So Local income tax is a very good way to supplement funding of your budgets. I think this county's done a good job at exercising your options. Um, there's kind of different buckets of local income tax. The expenditure bucket is really the main bucket because that has certified shares, which can be used for anything and gets deposited in your general fund. There's public safety, economic development, correctional facility, EMS, judicial, and acute care hospital. You all are taking advantage of 5 of those expenditure rates. The maximum expenditure rate that you can have is 2.5%. You're at 1.77. So you still have room if you need to increase or implement a local income tax. You have room or capacity of 0.73%. There was some proposed legislation to increase that 2.5 to 3. I don't know if that's still in the proposed legislation, but right now 2.5 is the max. You do also have property tax relief, which is also very important because that helps to drive down those circuit breaker credits. So that's also a very good income tax to have. So all in all, your income tax rate is 2.02%. You do have capacity of 0.73% if you need to increase any of your local income tax. So just for you all to know, just your county unit, this is not countywide, just the county unit will take in 2025 about $12 million of local income tax. And you can see the different categories there. So that's pretty good. That's quite a bit of revenue to be used to fund different areas of your budgets. Now, I don't know if this has been discussed or not, but I'm going to go ahead and discuss it. So you all had made a few changes with your local income tax, your public safety last year, in the middle of last year. And DLGF made a certification. Well, it wasn't quite what you all intended. So we're trying to get DLGF to recertify that. We think they should. But just so you know what's going on, the first column is what DLGF certified. So the total amount doesn't change. It's 6.2 million. But we need to make a few changes as to how much goes to dispatch. The city of Newcastle stays the same. You committed 125,000. Fire departments, we didn't mean to commit, 0.05%. I think that's what DLGF certified. It really should have been about 204,000. And then the remainder to municipalities should be a little bit higher. So we're still working on trying to get DLGF to confirm our changes, but just to let you know, that's kind of where we stand right now. If you just want to know where does Henry County fall in the whole state in regards to local income tax rates, remember I told you you're at 2.02%. You're kind of in the middle, sort of in the upper middle there of the whole state. You're certainly not the highest and you're not the lowest. So you're kind of right there in the middle. So I thought that it would be good to show you kind of where you fall in relation to other counties. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about before I get to Jason is the comprehensive financial plan. So we have been preparing and updating a comprehensive financial plan for the county for the last few years. You can go to the next slide. I have to kind of tell you that this is a great decision-making tool for you. We do this for a number of counties and municipalities in the state, and it really makes your budget process more streamlined. I think we're getting ready to start another, are we getting ready to start it? We have started another update? Okay. So this is a planning model for you to use, not only during budget time, but throughout the whole year. You can work in the effects of raises or additional staff to see if it can be sustainable throughout future years. We brought a couple copies of the last edition, which was October 2024. If anybody wants it, we can hand those out later, but we are going through an update as it is now. This is going to be perfect for you at the end of the legislative session because we'll be able to work in whatever crazy stuff they pass at the end of April. Because we need to know, what revenues or what do you have to fund for 2026? Because again, I think it's going to be a challenge. So we can work those into the cash flows and see if things are sustainable going forward. And we have worked with you pretty closely over the past several years. Next slide. And again, this is just kind of what I discussed. It's really helpful sometimes if the department heads can come in and, and kind of get a summary of this financial plan so they know why you're saying no or why you're telling them we need to cut certain things. You know, we're at a point now, if all this legislation passes, that we're really going to have to work on prioritizing our needs. You know, we might have to do more priority-based budgeting where we need to allocate resources to the services that are most important to the county. And that might mean that some services don't get fully funded. It's going to be tough, not only for you, but other counties throughout the state. Next slide. This is just an example of what you might find in the financial plan. Among all the schedules, there is a schedule that shows the estimated ending cash, so you can see kind of where you've been trending. Your cash reserves have been really pretty strong, but you take the time to try to balance your budgets, and that's really what it's all about. But again, that's what I like about these financial plans is because at a glance, you can see kind of how you've been trending in each of your major funds. The next slide is your general fund. And again, I think this is important because it's going to show you the receipts that go in the general fund, what you're spending historically and projected into the future, your operating balances, your cash reserves. As you can see, you've increased those over the past few years. At the end of 2023, you were at 40%. I haven't looked to see where you're at the end of 2024, but that's very strong cash reserves. But again, you may have to dip into that. With no growth in property tax and growth in expenditures, because you can't control that, you may have to utilize some of those reserves. So that brings me to the end of my section. Do you have any questions before we move on to Jason?
I was just going to say we almost hit the 50%.
Oh, good.
That was the
Yes.
target that we talked
Right,
about
right.
6 years ago, and
Exactly.
we're at 49%. So,
And that's
pretty exciting.
ideal. That's ideal. You can't really get better than that. Because when you get above 50%, we say, hey, start making plans for that, either investing, capital plans, et cetera. Because 50% is really the ideal level.
So I know this is a crystal ball question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, Paige. Back on page number 8, when you gave the projected impacts
Mhm.
for this year, and this is just SB1.
This is just SB1.
So
Yep.
this doesn't take into account some of the other things like that are possible that could hit us, like the personal property tax changing or some
Yeah.
of these other bills that are floating.
Yeah, who knows what's going to be stuck in at the end. The personal property stuff right now is dead, but again, something could get stuck in at the end. So yeah, you're right. This is just Senate Bill 1.
And in your opinion, this is probably best case scenario. It's probably going to go worse than this.
I would say, I honestly don't know. I think that this is way better than it was at the end of January because these are numbers from what happened on February 11th. And there was a bunch of stuff that was stripped out. So this is actually way better. I don't know that it's going to get any better. And you're right, it could potentially get worse.
Yeah, from what I'm hearing, the governor's not happy with where it's at. So
That's
it's
right.
getting
That's why
worse.
it'll be interesting today, because today I heard there were supposed to be some amendments. There were some meetings behind closed doors with the governor, I think yesterday and the day before. So we'll see what comes out of today. You just never know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody have any other questions? Paige?
A couple things I'd like to add before I go to the bonding is things that I've heard and you probably have heard as well, and things that we've talked about, over the years as we've been helping you with the comprehensive financial plans and the ending cash balances. And one that was brought up about our goal of a 50% cash reserve. That was one of the things that I heard a few weeks ago that legislators were kind of complaining or pointing the finger at municipalities that looking at the cash reserves and how healthy some communities are. And having a 50% or even 40%, that's pretty healthy. I mean, that's been a goal of ours, for years. So I commend you for getting to that point. But
Sorry to interrupt, Jason, but considering we started in the red.
yeah,
most
I didn't
of
want to
us
say
in this
that, but
council,
yes,
and back
yeah.
in 2018.
Yes, yeah, that $365 balance in the general fund is not as impressive as you are now. But I bring that up because I think those who are looking at balances right now, I think, and I bring this up to talk for you to talk to your legislators or whoever will listen, is because I think it's to look at your balances now is not an accurate picture of where you guys have come from and where you're projected to go, not just Henry County, but everyone in the state. Because you guys have done a great job and you've really tightened your belts on when you're looking at your budget. But honestly, what has helped not just you, but a lot of communities in the state is ARP funds, where you've been able to pay for things out of your general fund or others that you wouldn't have other had to pay for or would have been using these balances. And the interest earnings that we have seen in the last couple of years have really helped us achieve these balances. And that's what I don't think legislators understand, is that if it weren't for those two things, not just your ending balance, but a lot of other communities in the state, their ending balances would be looking a lot, not nearly as good as they do now. And in some cases, they'd be probably going negative. And I think that's key to keep in mind, as based upon the maximum levy growth that we had before, the 4%, your costs were increasing by more than 4% per year. I mean, all these other things were working against us. We just had a couple of very large positive things that helped us get to where we are now. Without those things, we wouldn't have these healthy balances. So I think it's not really, I think, wise for legislators to look at your balances right now and say, hey, look how healthy you are. You need to spend that. Because without any changes right now, my guess is, and I think we've shown that in comprehensive financial plans, this is why you increased your income taxes last year, you would be spending your balances just based upon the current statute right now. So I bring that up because you are very healthy. You guys have done a great job, but under even the current statute, we start be eating into those balances pretty quickly, I think.
Jason, do you guys at Baker Tilly or similar entities have a seat at the table with the governor to share this kind of information, or?
We don't have a seat at the table, but we do work with AIC and AIM and others, and they ask us for our advice on legislation. And I mean, I think Paige is in a weekly call with
Good.
them, AIM, so they hear, our input
And
indirectly.
When the ARP and the opioid and all these other things that have manna from heaven, you're right. I think we're going to have to really tighten our budgets because we've been living on that manna somewhat.
So I just wanted to bring that up because if you hear that from legislators about your healthy balances, I think that's important to bring up, that it's for those reasons, not because you're collecting so much revenue from property taxes.
So they would make the argument that we're overtaxing. That's what they're saying. They should be able to draw that line pretty easily, you would think.
The other thing that I know we've talked about this for years as well, and it's the way the mandates are being pushed down on you and the limitations on the property tax growth. They're really forcing you to increase your local income taxes, which you guys have made those difficult decisions here, last couple of years. Ken, I know some of those calls, that's what we're hearing too, is legislators saying, we've given you the tool, that 2.5% max from Lowit. No county is at that max. So don't come complaining us about increasing property taxes or taking property taxes away, because you have the ability to increase taxes somewhere else. Just wanted to let you hear that's what we're hearing from some legislators, is they think that your solution. Not to say that we agree, but just wanted to bring that out as well before we moved on.
If I may ask, looking at, and maybe I should have asked Paige, so I apologize. Looking at the summary of actual and estimated cash balances, I'm looking at negatives at the end of 2026 and 27 in the public safety lit estimated, and motor vehicle highway and restricted. That's kind of concerning that those are going to be so far in the negative in the next year or two.
Yeah, those are, kind of annual decisions that we're gonna have to make on, are we gonna reduce the budget, i.e. reduce services potentially? Are we gonna have to move some revenue around? As Paige said, we do have some flexibility in some of the funds where we can move expenses and revenues around. Or are we going to have to look at increasing, revenue from income tax or, so those are, yes, those are the decisions that we're going to have to make, because those aren't sustainable.
No. So I'm assuming, and I would have to look at the, what was budgeted, into the public safety lit. I would hope maybe that some of those could be pulled out. I know there's quite a bit of salaries and vehicles and different thing in public safety. Do you, and I won't hold you to any statement that you make, is our general fund cash balance strong enough to pull those things out of public safety lit? Because I know and I don't know, does these cash balances, does that include the interest in the art money, or is it just?
It should include interest earnings, but I'll be honest with you, right now, it's hard to make much projections on what we're going to collect in 2026 until legislation is over and we've had a chance to interpret that.
I was gonna add to that, the public safety lit and the motor vehicle highway, because I looked at this last night. We've got some capital outlays that we've flatlined going forward, but I think those you could pull out. I mean, you don't want to pull them out probably, but if the first thing to go usually is capital, right? So I think there are ways, just like Jason said, we might need to pull out
It's gonna
capital.
be, boy,
defer
citizens are gonna
it.
be really upset when
Yeah.
we say we're not gonna fix the culverts and the bridges and we're
Well,
closing all the roads.
Right, but that would be opposed to laying people off, right? So I mean, yeah, it's gonna be a challenge. We'll have to really take a look at that when we start updating this.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but also, if you look, the general fund balance, while it was headed straight up, is now heading back down.
Mhm.
So it is reducing. So pulling
Yep.
daily bills out of a general fund with no way to replace it is probably not the best move either.
Yeah, it's gonna be a challenge, yeah, because yes, it was at 50%, but now we're down to 41%, so we're on a downward trend
Yeah.
in that. And then if you're taking the interest, all of that's gonna eventually go away because the money that's drawing the interest is
The
it's
$1
going to
billion.
be spent by the end of 2026, so you can't count on that. And it's my understanding, the supplement, DLGF is saying not to use any of the supplemental
The supplemental income.
income.
Yeah, we don't include that in there because it's not
Okay,
guaranteed.
right.
I mean, hopefully it will be another couple years till we receive it just because the economy has been doing well.
Mhm.
But I definitely wouldn't count on that long term.
Thank you.
And, I misspoke, or Paige didn't understand me. We haven't been hired to update the CFP this year. I just haven't had that conversation. I knew we were having this meeting, so I wanted to see how this meeting occurred and if that's something that you'd want us to update or not. But yeah, we definitely can and definitely encourage it, especially with everything going on.
Well, I mean, my opinion, but I think we're gonna have to after we figure out where the legislature lands,
Mhm.
because it's gonna have a massive impact on all of us. And we also have some other things to discuss and lots of things. I mean, Steve and I were in a meeting this morning that drastically changes our budget for next year.
And as you know, on those comprehensive financial plans, we can run different scenarios as you're looking at different options. It's just not a one, year effect. It can have multiple years effect. So we can kind of help show how a decision today may impact 2 or 3 years down the road. So if you're looking at those types of things, we can run those for you. Something else that you had asked us to look at was just bonding. As you know, the county has gone through a number of different bond issues over the years. But with the new members, we were asked to just kind of give a big overview of that process and the options of the county as you're looking at, possible new ways to fund some capital projects. If you go to the next slide on page 28, one of the questions that we often get asked is why just can't you go to the bank and get a loan? And whether you get a loan, you do a bond issue, you're borrowing money, and there's certain statutes and processes that you have to follow to do that. to do it legally. If you turn the page to 29, we often also hear about home rule, and home rule gives you the flexibility to go out and get loans. But the statute also says that if there are laws in place and processes in place to do certain things, you have to follow those statutes. And there are a number of different statutes in place that gives you authority to issue bonds and borrow money. So that's why the attorneys, and both these slides are for Mice Miller, so I have to give them credit for it. That's why they often, have these certain processes, public hearings that you have to go through to borrow the money. Because that's, even though there is home rule, you have some flexibility. Since those laws are in place, we have to follow those. Oftentimes, even if you are working with a bank, they'll often ask for your local attorney or a bond attorney to give them a bond opinion that the bonds are tax exempt. So another reason to kind of go through the process. For bonds, it's just really a mechanism to issue a document to allow you to raise funds to pay for mostly capital projects. And we've listed a number here. As you know, you've done bonds over a couple of years to help pay for buildings and a number of things, just such as the jail. We've done food and beverage bonds to help pay for a lot of different capital projects throughout the county. The economic development, public-private partnerships. I brought that in here, and I know we had a meeting, I think last week or a couple weeks ago, and we'll have one here soon. Any bond issue that's done through the County Redevelopment Commission, for economic development, that has to be approved by the council. So oftentimes you may not involved as much in the weeds on some of those deals, but you do have the ultimate authority on whether those bonds get approved or not through for economic development projects, like the one we're talking about now for Sam Hall project. And then general obligation bonds can be issued either payable from property taxes, which we have one bond issue right now that we'll talk about a little bit more later, or they can just be general revenue bonds, such as the one you have outstanding that's payable from the food and beverage. So on page 31, just the type of bonds. Again, the property tax bonds we'll talk about, lease bonds, bond anticipation notes. I won't really talk about here, but those are really just some short-term financings, anywhere from usually 1 to 5 years, where those types of financings are done where, let's say we have a project that we want to do right now, but we're not going to receive revenue for 3 or 4 years, but we need the money now. So we'll issue a short-term financing and then take it out with a long-term bond at that time once we know what the revenue stream is. And then the revenue bonds, those are like the jail bonds that we're using for income tax, pay those back, and then also the food and beverage bonds. The property tax bonds, want to talk about those a little bit more. Again, they're payable from a property tax, so it is a new tax on the taxpayers within the county, so everyone in the county. It's based upon their net assessed value that Paige went over with you. Kind of talked about the net assessed value. They can be subject to petition remonstrance, certain thresholds. That's around $6 to $7 million right now. That just means if it's over that threshold, there is a chance that if you have enough people object, I think it's 500, that you could go to a race. We have not experienced that here. And then if it's over around 19 million now, 19 to $20 million, if it's over that threshold, it could be subject to a referendum. And that's where it goes on the ballot for vote for everyone in the county. I guess before I go to the next slide, one thing that we'll talk about, can you go back to slide 14? With the property tax bond, something that I want to keep in mind as if you're thinking about that as an option, that is a new tax on the property taxpayers. So in this instance here, if we were to issue a bond and it would increase the property tax rate for, let's say, looking again at the city of Newcastle, let's say we're to issue a bond, the county were, and it would increase the tax rate from $4.23 to say $4.25. This taxpayer would still not pay more than $2,000. So it's important to remember They wouldn't, the taxpayer wouldn't see any impact of this one in particular, but what would change is that they would receive a larger credit. So that instead of receiving a credit of $2,190, they may receive a credit of $2,300. So where that impacts the county is if you go to the next slide, we were allocating that 2,190 and we were seeing that the county would lose $324 for an increase in circuit breaker. Now you may lose $375 from this taxpayer because again, they're not paying anything more, even though you're charging, they're just going to receive a larger credit, which you'll have
So,
to eat.
so basically you're saying anybody who's already at the circuit breaker, it won't impact, but anybody who's not at the circuit breaker, it could impact them and possibly even push them into the circuit breaker.
Correct. That's correct.
And that'll just keep rolling downhill and they'll raise tax rates in accordance to make that work. Okay.
And also, if the county were to, and not just county, but the city, anyone in this taxing district were to issue debt, no one in at least this taxpayer, their credit would be larger. So every one of these units, the county, the township, the school, the library, they would see an increase in circuit breaker losses. So we all share in that loss. So I just wanted to bring that up. And that's why, when we try to issue debt, we always try to keep it tax neutral. So as debt's been rolling off, and we'll show that here in a minute, we're just replacing that old debt with new debt that can try to keep the tax rate as level as possible so we don't see this happen. If you go back to page 33, one thing that we always look at when we're issuing debt is what we call the statutory debt limit. And that's the statute for the Indiana code. That's basically that we can't issue more than 3% or 2% of the county's assessed value, net assessed value. So you take your certified net assessed value, which is $2.3 million, you multiply it by 2%, divide by 3, and you see there on the right side, your general obligation debt limit is $15.3 million. Now you have 3 bonds outstanding that count towards that. The 2015 food and beverage bonds, there's 1.4 million still outstanding. We issued another set of food and beverage bonds in 2022. There's 3.2 million outstanding of principal on that. And then the general obligation bonds that are payable from property taxes, there's 3.5 million outstanding on that. So you subtract out those 3 bonds, leaves about $7 million, over $7 million of debt limit that we have available to issue additional general revenue bonds or general obligation bonds. And that's what we've done the last couple of times for those smaller bond issues that roll off every 3 to 5 years. Now we can issue more than that, but then we have to go to a different statute, the lease rental statute. And and this is what we did for the jail bonds, if you remember. We had to create a building corporation. And from your standpoint, from Debbie's standpoint, lease bonds look very similar to GO bonds. You collect your revenue, you pay them every 6 months. But from a legal standpoint, from the state statute, leases aren't considered bonds, so they don't count towards that statute, that statutory debt limit. So if we did have a project that was for more than $7 million, let's say we wanted to make significant improvements to the courthouse, and it was going to cost $10 million, we could still finance it. We would just have to go through this lease structure and go through a building corporation, just like we did for the jail. But it's something that we have to go through the calculations, and it does change the process that has to be approved. But I just want to point that out, that we're not limited by your debt limit. We have to look at it. And if we go above that amount, we just have to take a different route to get to meet your goals. Page 36. The revenue bonds, again, and these are something other than property taxes. If you wanted to pay for the bonds through some other source, we can use the local income taxes that you have in place. Like I said, you've done for the jail bonds. Tax increment financing, the county Regional Commission has a number of bonds outstanding payable from the tax increment it collects. Food and beverage, wheel tax, really any other revenue that you do receive, we could use that in bond for it. And you can use the combination of both. If you remember for the jail bonds, those bonds are payable from the jail rate with a property tax backup. property tax backup we never intend to use. It's just for marketability to help us get the lowest interest rate possible, but you could put that in place. We do these all the time, issue these revenue bonds. They tend to be a little bit more expensive, maybe have a little bit higher interest rate, but it's really just based upon the revenue that you have available is what we use in the project that you want to fund. Page 27, things to consider. Talked about the debt limit, your revenue source. You know, that's one thing. If you were wanting to look at your edit or public safety or some revenue that you have, we definitely want to look at, you know, your current operating costs and see really what you have available. We've had some clients that have issued bonds payable from income taxes that we weren't involved with because they saw, okay, yeah, we're collecting, you know, $500,000 a year. Our payments are $350,000. We can afford that. And they don't take into consideration, or who they're working with doesn't take into consideration. Yeah, but we use 300,000 of that to cover operating costs. So we don't really have $500,000 available. So that's something that we definitely work with you on whatever revenue stream you have to really see what's available to cover that and make sure that if there's a downturn in the economy or the revenue stream, there's enough to pay for it so you're not strapped. With revenue bonds, there are some things on the right side that we need to think about: reserve funds, minimum coverage. There's just some extra things that we have to think about if we're looking at funding bonds from food and beverage or income taxes that you don't have to think about through property taxes. I put a couple of slides on here for build, operate, transfer, or BOTS. I didn't know, they're very popular right now. A lot of communities are using them, and there's definitely some pros and cons to those. So I put those in here, just hopefully you can use this PowerPoint as a reference source. But the BOT, or build, operate, transfer, is really just a procurement, another way to hire firms to help build a project. It's really outside the financing. But I did put this in here because, again, they are becoming more popular and more of our clients are using them. And the alternatives, design, bid, build, or have a construction manager. It's really depending upon if you want to kind of work with someone from the very beginning, from beginning to end, that you know upfront that you want to work with. So you're not have to go out and get the lowest bid, and then that company may or may not be the person who did the original design, or who you've been working with from the beginning. But whatever decision that you take, you know, we can finance it in a similar method. Page 39, again, just some of the benefits and risks. It has more control on choosing who you pick or who you work with. You have more opportunity to negotiate. Single point of responsibility, so you're not dealing with many subcontractors. You do have a guaranteed maximum price. The only thing that I would comment on the guaranteed maximum price is I think it's important on when you get that number. And again, I don't know if you're talking about any of these projects, but if you think about it, the sooner you get that number, from what I'm hearing from the developers, probably the larger that number is going to be, because it's in the front of the process, and they're going to put their contingencies in it. They're going to talk to their subcontractors. They're going to put all their contingencies in it. So if you can wait and get the guaranteed maximum price closer towards the end of the design, you'll probably get more accurate picture of what it's going to cost, and that guaranteed maximum price will be a smaller number. But that's something else. There's a lot of, usually either way, there's still a lot of contingency involved, because the developer doesn't want to get, you know, there at the end holding the bag on a large amount of contingencies. So that's something we're not usually involved in that part of the negotiating. But if you are working with a BOT, and I would definitely say if there's any contingencies left over, that goes to the county and doesn't go to the developer for extra profit. Page 40, just some more information about BOTs if you want them. Page 41, I do list all the bonds that you have outstanding. We already talked about the three. The only other bond that doesn't count toward your debt limit is the jail bond that we did in 2020, the lease rental bonds of 2020. They mature in 2040. And you can see there's over $22 million of principal outstanding on those bonds.
Jason, so you said the first two are food and beverage, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, And then the courthouse renovation, go bond, okay,
Yeah.
and then the jail.
So that third one there, the general obligation bonds of 2022, you can see that's going to end in January 1, 2027. There's about $3.5 million outstanding there. So what I did, just for illustration, if you go to the last page, I showed the annual payments. Well, if you go to the far right, I've showed what the tax rate has been historically for the county. So this is just the tax rate that's applied to cover any debt that you had outstanding at that time. So in 2021, we had a tax rate of about 12.5 cents. In 2022, it went down to 11 cents, 2023, 10 cents, 2024, 8 cents. 2021, 22, and 23, the reason those tax rates went down is kind of Paige alluded to it earlier, is because your tax base has increased. Your bond payment was pretty much the same every year, but as your tax base increased, we were able to drive down the tax rate a little bit. 2024, it went down a little bit more than anticipated because we thought we might be issuing more debt at that time in 24 and 25. So we allowed for the tax rate to drop in anticipation if we did issue more debt, it wouldn't be that big of an impact or an increase on the taxpayers. But we didn't do that. So in 2022, or the 2022 bonds, the 2025 tax rates down to 7 cents. So then I just showed as if you had a project that you wanted to fund and we issued bonds this year, and I just threw out $5 million over 4 years, we could, there would be a slight increase in the tax rate from 2025 to 2026 because your tax rate right now is 7 cents. If we increased it to 8 cents, so about a penny, we could pay off $5 million in 4 years. But you can see that 8 cents, looking at historical, that's still less than what the taxpayers have been paying for debt related to the county. And again, this is just for illustration. We could do anything if there's a project or projects that you're interested to, but this is kind of how we've done it and worked in the past where we issue debt and try to roll against the debt that you have outstanding that's rolling off. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or any about bonds or specific projects or specific process.
Jason, is the high 12 cents due to Justice Center, jail? Why was it so high initially in the early 20s?
We did have the Justice Center bonds still outstanding at that time, but also your tax base was lower. So as your tax base has increased over time, your tax rate has gone down. Because we tried to keep your debt pretty much constant throughout that whole time. The benefit we've seen is your assessed value has increased. Because when we do bond issues, we don't ever make that assumption that your tax base is going to increase. We keep it flat. And then hope that the tax rate goes down as a pleasant, positive outcome.
And I think we've been resistant to going beyond, in other words, tapping into the lease revenue bonds, lease rental bonds. We've always tried to keep so we don't have to go into that level of.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of only bonding what you really think you need. And we've always been able to stay under that geo obligation as well. Some of the issues is the lease financing does take more time. It is a more lengthy process. And in the last couple of years, when we've talked about bonding, it's been toward the end of the year, and it would have been difficult to get a lease financing done in that short period of time. But also, part of it had to do with the projects that you were thinking about funding. We could do that within your geo debt limit.
Jason, why'd you pick 4 years?
I just picked $5 million just as a number, and then I just tried to pay it off as quickly as possible to keep the tax rate level.
Okay, so the general obligation bonds aren't at a sweet spot over 4 years, or there's no limit. They could be up to 10 years or something
They could be
like
up to
that.
20 years are max. But historically, we've always tried to pay them off quickly and just because we've kind of used the geo bonds as kind of another way to help fund capital projects because we're not able to fund nearly any capital projects through our general fund and because of our budget constraints.
And we've kind of being on the council, we've done that several times. Like we took out one, the first one paid for, new election equipment and 1.2-ish million went to the expo project. And then we did it again for building projects right before I came off the council a couple years ago. And that's what the commissioners are working on with the building. It's been like a short-term, project type scenario is what we do with what we've done historically with Go bonds.
What's the interest rates now? I know they've gone up the last year or two, but
Well, the market's kind of weird right now because short-term rates are almost as high as long-term rates. So, I mean, we just did Hancock County, we did a 20-year bond and the rate was a little over 4%. But even if you did like a 5-year bond, they're probably around 3 and 4%.
I think the Sam Hall bond was right around 4% for that TIF bond.
Yes, it's 3.11%, but that's, we're funding that through a state program. So it's kind of at a subsidized rate, which is why we're going through that. That's a taxable bond, and because we're asking the developer to guarantee that, we'd probably be looking more at a 7.5% interest rate because it's taxable.
So this week, we also received an email from Corey Murphy, who's stating that at the federal level, they're looking at making the municipal bonds non-tax exempt to the investors. Now, I don't know how much that's going to go through or not, but that's going to be another, we'll just say hiccup at the local level if that goes through as well.
Yeah, you're right. There is discussion, and they've talked about that before, getting rid of the tax exempt status. It means we could still issue bonds. It's just going to be more expensive.
Jason, I had asked you if you could talk to us about the possibility of using opioid funds to pay for our YOC
Mhm.
reopening. And I didn't know if you could talk to all of us about what you thought of that.
Yeah. And you mentioned, as you know, you do have restricted and unrestricted funds that you receive. And did I send you an email this morning?
Not that I saw. I don't.
Okay,
think
I
so.
think I meant to, and Joel or Debbie, did you get it? Okay, I think I forgot to send it. I do have, Paige and we do have a list of what the restricted funds can be used for, so I can send that to you. One thing is, yes, we can use those funds to help pay for capital projects if it's the unrestricted, because I think they're unrestricted. Restricted, I looked through it and it's quite a few pages long. Do you have a copy of that? It's pretty restricted on what it can be used for, as you can imagine. It's a lot of it's for training and services to provide for that. So I don't know if it would qualify. It would depend upon what exactly you want to use it for. It might be able to use it for salaries.
There's a piece of it that's gonna be, right, Steve, they talked about a piece that we would need to pay for training, so possibly.
So
that
yeah,
piece
training was
would be used
definitely
for that.
on there. So I will send that to you. I apologize. I meant to send that to you this morning. So
Debbie, did you say we haven't used any restricted funds so far? Is that what you told me? That's not what you told me. We're using just non-restricted right now. Okay.
So I will send that list to you. And there's also, I think, a list. I don't know if you've seen this or not, but I think it's on the LGF website. It shows what other counties have used their opioid for. So that might be a good resource to see what other counties are doing. But I would, regardless of what they've used it for, I would just make sure Joel looks at it to make sure it's legal. But we'll send that to you.
And how many years forward are we supposed to receive opioid funds through?
It says a long time. What I'm not sure,
Like,
yeah, and I don't know how, we had the estimates and I saw the file that you sent, and I think Paige has one too that may be a little bit more current. It does go out for a number of years. I just don't know is how definite those amounts are.
We
So,
wouldn't want to bond against them.
Yeah,
It would be uncertain.
right. Mhm. that's a revenue stream that we could bond for it. And maybe if it's a short-term bond, I'd feel more comfortable, but like going out 10 years, I wouldn't count that it's going to be there, or at least the amounts that they're predicting right now.
And I don't believe there's a time frame that we have to have all of that money expended.
I don't
Like
think
the
so.
art money, I don't think there's
I don't
you
think
have to
there is.
spend by a certain date.
Now, we could always do, and you've kind of done this with your food and beverage bonds, and we did this for statutory reasons. You can do a general revenue bond payable from the county, and that'd be from any legally available source of the county. And then you could use the unrestricted opioid funds to help pay for that. But just knowing if for some reason, 5 years down the road, you're no longer receiving that, we have to, pivot and use some other revenue stream. So we just want to be prepared for that risk.
So let's, go back to the legislature and their possible changes this year. What impacts, if any, would that possibly have on our bonding or decisions to bond, or just so we all understand going into this eyes wide open?
Yeah, and Paige, feel free to jump in here too. Some of the things that we're seeing, Paige has already mentioned that, for homeowners, we already receive significant deductions and exemptions. They're talking about, increasing those. That's what that's going to do is decrease our tax base, which we talked about has had positive benefits for the county, because as our tax base has increased, that's reduced our circuit breaker losses. If our tax base starts to decrease, then we're going to increase our circuit breaker losses. So instead of losing like the 14% that we're losing now, it could be back up to 18%, like we were losing a couple years ago. So that's a real key concern that I have with some of the proposals, is because they're looking at decreasing this net assessed value for homeowners. They're looking at, I think this is still on the table, redoing the calculation for farmland, so that the assessment for agricultural, it's been going up. They're looking at doing that, so it's going down. That's going to really hurt your tax base, being a rural county. So that's one of my concerns, is how the tax base is going to impact your tax rates, which is going to increase them, which is going to increase your circuit breaker losses and give us less for our general fund and other funds.
So it can have a significant impact on the decision whether or not to bond and our ability to.
I
pay
think
those
so,
off.
because again, like this, we're going to try to keep your tax rate neutral. But if we didn't do anything, your tax rate would go down. It would potentially keep going down, or it could go back up because of the tax base. That's something we'd have to look at. Now, it all depends upon what projects that you're wanting to fund and, prioritizing. Because if these are projects that you definitely need, and we do property taxes, as I showed on that page 14 or 15, if circuit breaker increases, you're sharing that with really every taxing unit in the county. So, we work for a lot of the communities and other communities in the county, but that's one benefit from the county. You're not putting all that weight on you. You're sharing it with everyone else. Same thing like for Newcastle. As you know, we work for the city of Newcastle, and they did a bond issue last year. And, I stood up in front of their council and their public and said, for just about everyone in the city of Newcastle, their taxes are not going to increase because they're all at the cap, like we just showed. But what is going to happen is all the units' circuit breaker losses are going to increase, including the cities, and we calculate for them. And we mentioned that it's going to increase the counties and the schools as well. So it's not a situation that any of us want to be in, but we're all going to have to share in the pain, and will, based upon the decisions we make.
So that is an interesting premise. When we pass a GO bond, we basically take those revenues from circuit breakers from the other overlapping taxing districts.
Mhm.
So it's not really the John Q. Public through their property tax paying it as much as they're losing it from other.
It depends where you live. Because like if you live in the city, you're probably not going to see an impact on your taxpayer. If you live in, Blue River Township, you might see an increase.
A fair number of our residents are at circuit breaker. I would say a fair number of county residents are at circuit breaker. I know the city, pretty much all of the city is. All the rental homes owned in the city are, for sure. Yeah.
So
Okay,
w- so-
interesting.
Did I interrupt somebody? It sounds to me as our financial advisor that maybe we need to make decisions relating to a new bond till after the dust settles at the legislative level, like in May. And did you say we have not asked you to do the 5-year comp plan
I
yet?
don't think, I haven't brought it up and I don't think we've,
So, so that's up to the commissioners, right? Since it's a contract. As a council member, we hope that that goes forward. That has been invaluable at budget time. Just, I think that's understood, but I needed to say that.
I think it'd be difficult for any of you to really make an informed decision until we know more about what's going to happen with legislation and the impact to their general fund and circuit breaker and potentially income tax too. Now, if you have a project that you're going to need to do regardless, then, that might be a different matter, but I still think you'd want to know what the impacts are going to be with that decision. And that also might make you decide, will we do a 4-year bond issue or, a 10-year bond issue? Because we have flexibility now. I just tried to keep the tax rate at, 8 cents. We could do $5 million and then have it paid over 7 years, so your tax rate still drops. So that might help offset some of these other variables that we don't have control over. So that's how we could still maybe accomplish funding a project and still reduce the impact.
And the courthouse bond, you said that expires in 27.
Yeah, so if we do nothing, 2026 will be the last time that you'll have a tax rate, and it'll be around, 7 cents if your tax base is unchanged.
So Jason, on the bond proposal I sent you, the first item were the small structures that we talked about doing for about 2.5 million. And one of the different funding options we've talked about is increasing the levy split to the Cume Bridge Fund. And I feel like there was a time requirement that change needed to be made by. Was that in March? Oh, end of May. Okay. So potentially the council could initiate that, and then if things don't go well during the legislative end of session, the commissioners approve the rate change.
So if that rate is changed, then all the other units in the levy, general fund, health, park, would be lowered.
You'd have
To
to reduce it
increase.
somewhere.
So it's not like we're just taking money from a different pot. We're taking money from other people to put into that pot. Okay, thank you.
Now, and the reason we may want to do that, because it sounds like, well, why go through that hassle is, and I reached out to Ice Miller when I saw your question, and Lisa needed to get back with me, but right now, under current law, the county can't use property taxes, like can't issue a property tax bond to fund a bridge. Culverts, I wasn't for sure. That's why I asked Lisa. But I think, and she's double checking this too, but I know I've done this in other communities, where I think we can use the revenue that you collect from your bridge fund and bond that for bridges. But we're limited to that amount. So that's where it might make sense. But there is also a mechanism where we can get, it's a different statute, and it's called a loan, and we can't do more than $2 million, and it can't be longer than 10 years, but you can use that to help fund roads, bridges, and culverts, I know. So if Lisa can't get comfortable that we can use the bridge fund, we can maybe use that other statute and get there. I think get where you need, but we'd be limited to $2 million, but it's $2 million per project. So we might have to do, 2 million and $1 million to get all your projects done. Because there's culverts, I would consider as different projects.
And if we use the other statute, we don't need to change the levy necessarily. We could pay for that through a different, through property taxes, you're saying.
We're still looking at that, but I think we have some options. But there was actually a bill being proposed, I don't know if it's still out there or not, but it did allow counties to issue bonds to pay for roads and bridges. Because cities and towns have that ability, but for some reason counties don't. So that'd be great if that law, one of the few laws that would be good if it's passed. That would help you guys.
I know there was some talk through session right now about reducing the health funds that were going to health department. How did that?
Have you?
On Friday, we were at I think Kenan was attended as well, a webinar with AIC, like a halftime.
Mhm.
And it's still rolling through. I believe they want to reduce it by $50 million. I
That's
haven't heard
correct.
since then that
Yeah.
it's been killed, but they're wanting to reduce it by $50 million.
And that would greatly impact you because of you guys took advantage of that new law. So you're, using that. So if that were to be decreased by half, we might have to move some of our levy from our general fund back to our health fund.
Because we had talked about maybe increasing Cume Bridge and decreasing health because
Mhm.
of their great increase that they had. And there was some that wasn't budgeted by Angela last year, but if that would happen, then much harder to do that.
I don't think it was cut in half. I think it was like from 200 million statewide to 150 or maybe 150 to
It was 150 to 100.
100 million. So 1/3, yes.
Yeah. But for you guys, it would be a pretty significant impact.
Anyone have any other questions for Jason or Paige? I will again only say what I've said, and I hope, if the commissioners make this decision, I think it's going to be a necessity for us to have the 5-year plan this year with all these changes. The auditor's shaking her head violently over here, so she agrees. Yeah, I think I know it's an expense, but I think it's an expense we're going to have to be able to function over these next several years of drastic changes in our revenue structure.
I agree.
Anybody have anything else for these guys?
Yeah, I'm gonna ask a question about debt service over here, Jason.
Yeah.
So the way that's laid out, our debt service coming out of property taxes is $1.875 million in 2025. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so if we were to bond $5 million this year, that would increase our debt service coming out of property taxes by $258,000 for 2025. And then I understand it would drop off in 2027 and the 1.9 would. So my question basically is the 258,000 would come out of what would generally go to the general fund to be able to do that? Is that
No,
correct?
that $250,000 is new money.
That's,
Well, if it was no circuit breaker, it would be new money. If you remember that one slide that Paige had up there that had your controlled funds, your non-controlled funds, the controlled funds is all the funds in your maximum levy, and you have your debt and your Cume fund, that's kind of all new money. So that $258,000 would be,
so it would be outside
would
of.
be outside.
Okay,
The only caveat is because of, we're going from a 7-cent tax rate to an 8-cent tax rate, that might increase your circuit breaker a little bit. So if your circuit breaker is $1 million now, it might be $1,050,000. So that might decrease your general fund a little bit just because your circuit breakers are a little higher. So I want to be a little clear about that. But typically, it's not like if we didn't do this bond issue, your general fund would see an extra $258,000. That's not the case.
I just wanted to make sure our debt service wasn't going to decrease what we see in our general fund or any other fund from that standpoint.
Only if your circuit breaker increases from it.
So
And
it
that's
might,
why we're
it
trying
would
to keep
be
it level as
a little
possible.
bit at most. Okay, thank you.
And like I said, we could, again, I tried to keep it, that first year, that $258,000, we even have some flexibility on that. It's just, if we issue bonds in 2025, we're going to have a little bit of interest that's going to be due. I can't push back any more principal.
Sure,
So we'll have a little bit due in 26.
thank you.
So Jason, next year, we know that we've got 6 different districts that are going to take a big increase in their assessed value. Blue River Township, Prairie. I'll have to go ask Jerry, I can't remember them all. What's that gonna do to the circuit breaker with just those? Because they're ones that are, people are moving into, there's been a lot of housing, stuff done in those communities.
So you think their tax base is gonna increase significantly? Is it because of how, homes? I'd be cautiously optimistic that's gonna see a large increase, because just like we said, that $200,000 home, the net assessed value is only $98,000. It's gonna take a lot of homes to see a significant increase. So we want to look at that. But no, that is all positive. Any increase to our tax base is gonna be positive. So that's gonna, if we were expecting a large increase in our tax base because of these homes in 2026, it may not be an 8-cent tax rate. That alone may drop it back down to 7 cents or something even less. So yeah, anything we can do to increase our tax base is only a positive thing for us. So yeah, if those areas are reducing growth, that might have this picture look a little different.
When you have this conversation with other counties about changes coming, do you get, how many counties do you think are going to absorb the loss versus raise local income taxes, or is it too early for you to hear feedback?
Well, I think it's too early to tell. I think a number of the counties that I'm going to be talking to here, they've already increased their income tax just in the last couple of years, just like you have, because for the same reasons you have. But I think that's their only option. County that Paige and I go to next week, they haven't increased their income taxes for a while. They realize that's probably their only option. They're having difficulty this year. So even without the changes in statute. So it's the only option they really have is to increase income taxes. So I definitely think it's going to be more, maybe not this year, 26, because I think some people will need to feel the pain before they make that decision, but it's going to happen.
What do you think about this service tax idea?
It's a lot more volatile. That's my concern with that. I mean, if you think about, look at our income tax back in 2008 when we had the, depression, it went down, in some counties, double digits for a couple of years. So that's my concern with the service tax. It's so much more volatile than property taxes. It's going to be much more difficult to predict. And if we're looking at bonding, we'll want to, show like 150% coverage. That way, if there is a huge turn down in the economy, we have enough set aside to cover those shortfalls.
Is that J.D. Prescott's proposal? What you call the service tax?
Yes.
So
One of, I don't know if it's in others, but I know that's his big.
I don't know if Paige, if on your calls, if you talked about the service tax at all.
I think it's dead. It didn't get a second hearing.
I mean, at least they're thinking about alternatives rather than just wiping out property taxes. At least they're thinking about replacing with something. But yeah, you're replacing with something that's much more volatile.
Yeah, if we have another pandemic and they close down all the service industries, you're dead in the water. I mean, really, realistically, you're dead in the water.
Hey, Jason, I got a question. I thought I had this figured out till Shannon asked his question. I looked at that chart and I saw the debt retires next year. Then it makes sense to my commercial background that, we're going to have 1.8 million more in our general account every year. That's not the case. Our tax rate would change.
Yeah.
So
Tax
by
rate would go down by 7 cents.
by not getting a bond, we're not helping ourselves out at all. Our cash will not increase if we don't get a bond. Wow. Okay.
Isn't county government finance fun, Scott? Remember what I told you?
Yeah, you got to take your commercial, everything you learned and all common sense and throw it out the door when you come into
Forget
county
your
government.
business finance, forget
My
your
first
common
year,
sense.
I said, let's just not bond for a few years and say what we would be paying. Like,
Yeah.
that's not it.
It gets more legislative session too.
Can we go back, Jason, when you were talking about bonding and it increasing the circuit breaker losses for all the other taxing units, entities? Could you go through that one more time?
Yeah, hey, Debbie, do you mind going to page, I think, 15? Okay. So if you remember on the prior slide, that taxpayer of a $200,000 house, his property tax bill was going to be $4,190. But since he's capped at the 1%, he's not going to pay more than 2,000.
I understand about the homeowner. I thought you said something about bonding when you issue a bond and it reaches the,
Right, yeah, so I just want to.
okay, I'm sorry.
So for that homeowner, he's not gonna pay $2,000. So that $2,190 credit gets shared amongst everyone that he pays taxes to. So the county, you levied $324, or you thought you were gonna get an extra $324 from this person that you're not, because he received that credit. If we were to do a bond and it increased the tax rate, his credit, he's not gonna pay more than $2,000 again, but his credit's gonna go up to say 2,300. So now your part of that 2,300 is gonna be larger than 324. So you're gonna lose more and see higher circuit breaker losses because he's not, I mean, we could increase tax rates $1. He's not gonna pay
He's not
anything
gonna pay
more.
anymore.
You're just gonna have to
Right.
come up with it from somewhere else. The positive on your side is that extra dollar, the township's gonna have to help pay for it, the school's gonna have to pay for it, the city's gonna have to help you pay for it, everyone in the county is gonna have to help you
Help pay
pay
for
for that. That
And
amount.
this is probably a Debbie question and maybe I should ask it offline, but I'm going to go ahead. Do we get, Susan, could you kind of move your head a little bit? Thank you. Would we be able to get totals of how much of our property owners are already at the circuit breaker? Do you know, or is that a Jody Brown question? Do you understand what I'm saying? How many, if we have 90% of our property is already at the circuit breaker, I would just wonder if we could see that breakdown if that was available. And I figured I was probably asking for something that.
I don't know if
we
your
couldn't get, but-
treasurer's office might be able to print out a report that shows, they might be able to print out a report that shows everyone that gets a credit. That might be another way to research it.
Yeah, I'm not sure what kind of reports are available on Beacon, but obviously Beacon shows whether properties hit circuit breaker or
Yeah.
not. So I'm not sure if there's any reporting tools, but
That you might be able to print off a report with every taxpayer in the county, and one of the columns you should be able to print out is circuit breaker credit, and then sort it by that way.
Want to cause a whole lot of work, it's just one of those things that, are 10% of our homeowners at the credit or 90%?
Well, it's important, like when Newcastle did their bond issue last year, although a lot of people didn't believe me, it was easier to accept those who did to say, okay, we're gonna do this deal, but my taxes aren't gonna go up. Again, it's hurting the cities, and they had to be prepared for a higher circuit breaker impact, but they needed the money, so they were willing to do that. But from your constituents, that would be easy to say if you're looking at doing a bond, hey, majority of you in the county, you're already at the cap, you're not gonna see an impact if we go forward with this bond issue, and if there is an increase in tax rates.
Thank you.
So what was the information you said you were waiting on the state? I think it was Susan's question relating to the small structures, the bridges and culverts. What was it? We still needed to know.
We can definitely help you fund that through some type of financing. It just depends upon what bills get approved, if any, this year. That will dictate what process we use, but we can definitely finance.
But if we modify the cumulative building, which will have an effect on the other four.
Yeah.
We need to start that process, Paige said, no later than our April meetings, early April.
You can allow the 30-day monthly period to extend beyond the 31st of May, but
Then if it's approved, let's say the end of May, they approve to go to the max or whatever rate they want, could they have the ability, you know, in August or September, when they're working on their budget, to scale it back?
Yeah, because it's just, the commissioners are pushing the reestablished max, but if during budget time,
And what Susan shared, she said that's an estimate of over 2.5 million of significant needs relating to bridges and culverts. You said that that short-term bond you could work with after the dust settles with the legislative is 2 million. So is it possible, just exploring options, possible to do that 2 million and the other 5 go into one of the other options you described?
Potentially, or under that one loan program, you could do as many loans as you want. They just can't be more than 2 million. So we could do one for 1.5 and another one for 1 million to get to our 2.5.
So there, there'd just be some loss in origination fees because you'd be originating 2 loans instead of
Yeah.
1, but.
Yeah, but
it
we
could
would get them
still
all
be
approved at the
accomplished.
same time. We'd probably work with the same bank, so we would try to keep those costs to a minimal. But yeah, there would be a little bit for duplicate bond
But
document.
if we were to do the 2 million for that loan you were talking about, and the remainder 500,000 and plus be rolled into a potential geo bond that we may be considering, that's appropriate.
Under the current law, well, that's one thing I need to ask with Lisa Lee. Bridges, I know we couldn't. Culverts, we might be able to. Unless there's a law right now, or at least there was on is being proposed, that counties could do property tax bonds for bridges. What I just don't know if culverts are under that bridge definition. I didn't look at that before I came today.
We'll know that after the legislative session.
Yeah.
We got 2 major bridges in the county. It's gonna cost several millions of dollars that if we don't get federal aid for, within the next 5 years, we're gonna be closing them down. We're doing a bridge inspection. I just closed a road today, actually yesterday, out here on the county. The culvert is so bad that, it was recommended being closed. I expect to get at least 8 more within the next few weeks. It's gonna be closed. Because we got at least 20 structures right now that are failing that we've got to fix. And we could use $10 million just to fix bridges and culverts right now.
Yeah, I was in a northern county, it was back in November, and we had this conversation, and he's trying to evaluate, does he wait to get approval from the feds for these grants that are 2 or 3 years from now?
5 years out.
Yeah, and because he says by that time, the costs are gonna increase so much, it might make sense for him just to bond for it now through this program. And yeah, they're gonna have to pay for 100% of it, but they're gonna get it done now, which is a need for their constituents. Plus, it could be cheaper than what they may pay if they have to pay whatever percentage 5 years from now. So that's what he's evaluating.
The feds is a 80% reimbursement. That's why I was trying to push for the federal aid. And I wanted to bond our match at this point so that we could get started on the process, because these bridges are within 5 years of being closed. If we wait 5 years and do it, that means
Right.
it's gonna be 5 years farther before we're able to fix them. So if we start now, then when those, by the time federal aid comes in, we're at that 5-year mark where we're gonna close it anyway, but we close it to fix it.
Yep.
As opposed to leaving it closed another 5 years to try to fix it. So-
Steve, are those the 2 that are listed on the spreadsheet with the 4 asterisks? Are those the ones we're seeking federal? I don't recall the presentation several months back. That our 20% would be 400,000 and 350,000 on Kennard Road and 100 North. Are those the 2 that you're referring to?
One of them's
federal?
on county line, the other side of Nicetown. and I
Okay,
can't
that's the
remember what-
975 West.
So,
And the Kennard Road, those are the federal seeks.
and I don't remember the one on Kennard Road being one of the federal, but it may be. But yeah, those were the 2 that Joe had talked to me about that said that they were within 5 years of probably being completely shut down. So we're going to have to close roads. And that's what prompted my conversation at the commissioners conference with Jason to try to possibly bond for our 20% match. that if that would help, at that point, it would have been tax neutral because our other bond hadn't gone off yet. So there'd have been no increase anywhere. And I thought we could at least start the process of getting those two bridges funded. But we have a bunch of small structures now that, there was at least 5 or 6 of them that were on the critical list in 2017 that haven't been addressed. And like I said, I got the pictures 2 days ago. Barricades went up yesterday, and that structure is so bad that we just went ahead and closed the road. Problem is, if we don't do something to fix those, I had a conversation with Braden, is we don't pave this year because we take paving money and we fix structures. So there'll be 20 miles of paving that will not get done. We'll still chip and seal, but we will not pave.
Yeah, I don't think anyone wants that. Is your spreadsheet again that was shared recently by Susan. At the top, it says culvert replacement materials and costs. So are all those culverts, or is it a mix of culverts and bridges?
They're called, we have small structures, which are box culverts. Anything underneath 20 feet is considered a culvert, even though it looks like a bridge and it's designed like a bridge. It's called a culvert because it's less than 20 feet in length.
So everything on that spreadsheet are culverts then?
Yes,
Okay.
And these are current estimated costs from Joe Copeland.
because they're doing their inspection right now. And Braden told me yesterday that this was the first. I got an email from Joe saying the same thing, and basically told me to hold on because he figured there would be several more that would be added to it, that would be throwing barricades up probably in the next few weeks.
So this is where priority budgeting really absolutely positively
I would
is
say,
critical.
This
in
is
our roads.
arguably the biggest need.
What I can do is assuming I guess if the legislation changed, allowed us to use property taxes for this, and we didn't want to use the bridge fund, is that an option to use property taxes to fund these?
It
Me-
through the GO bond, if the legislation allows us, I think so.
Okay.
If we have, if the council says, okay, we could do 5 million, this is within the 5 million. There are other things that we want to consider also, but I think that by consensus, this is the top, we haven't all sat down and voted on what's the top, but
Well, what I can do is I can run a couple of different scenarios for you to look at. Whether we do property taxes or we do the bridge fund. That way, if we have to do the bridge fund, or that's the route you decide to go, we can look at the other bridge fund, how much do we need set aside for debt service? Because that might help you determine how much we might want to move over to the bridge fund of that levy, or, how many years we want to go out.
Steve, I know you had talked to Joe about, I know the list is just culverts, but there's bridges that are in need of repair as well. Is that correct? Besides just the two? Do you know what the total of that is?
No, I don't know the total. I know those were the two most critical that we were trying to apply for federal aid on, because the cost of those was going to be astronomical. And figured even 5 years out, that cost, like Jason said, it's going to increase. But if we get an 80% reimbursement back to the county, then that cuts our cost way down. So even waiting 5 years, if that puts us at that critical where we're closing, it's still going to be cheaper than us trying to come up with that total amount. Because we're talking just multiple millions of dollars just to do one bridge. Because those, I think, they were well over 20 feet. I can't remember what the one was. I don't think it was a superstructure, but they were large bridges. Like I said, we'll know more once this inspection comes back, but I've been cautioned for the last 6 to 8 months that this was going to get ugly real quick, and ugly is hit. So that's where we're at.
And something, and I don't know, I'm saying this without thinking, so it's probably not wise, but something we could consider, talk to Paige is, we talked about, went that 50% threshold. We talked about then maybe moving things to rainy day fund. We talked about that. Maybe we can start thinking about a capital plan and moving money over to the bridge fund, so that way in 5 years, we have a pot of money built up in that fund that can be used for the bridge when you're ready. That's something that we can kind of put in our comprehensive financial plan. Because I know sometimes when you put money in a rainy day fund, it's kind of forget what the initial purpose was and it rains more than you think it should and use it for other things that were
We're
never
getting ready
intended
to
to.
have a thunderstorm, just so you know.
Hey, Steve, I got a question. Are these numbers based on county employees doing all the work or any of these subcontracted?
The bridges and culverts would be subbed out. The culverts themselves, still culverts, the county will probably put the majority of those in.
Okay, so this chart is some of each.
Basically, yes.
Can they get them all done this year? Is this workload for 1 year?
It would be difficult. I think the plan was to try to get, roughly 20 of them in the next year or so to
Okay.
20, I think it was 26, I believe.
Joe
by-
Copeland said he thinks he can get them done by the end of 2026 if we provide funding relatively soon.
Okay, so if we do get the bond, we can go ahead and purchase the materials and get some down payments on subs, so we're saving some money by funding it all up front, right?
Yes.
The other thing that might apply is legislation is going to, currently as it stands, and it's likely pass, cut community crossings.
And if we lose community crossing money, just sum it up, we're screwed.
Not lose it entirely, but there's a significant cut in 2026 on community crossings because they're putting a big chunk in railroad crossings. The state wants to do that because they're critical in some places apparently. So we will lose some.
Also, this year alone, we applied for 30-some miles of just chip sealing, single, double, and triple sealing throughout the county. And community crossings is basically paying for all chip sealing.
Yeah, we'll be good this year, but what they're proposing next year, we're
Yeah.
going to take a cut.
And if that does it, because we've been on basically a 10-year plan to do roughly, I was thinking 50 to 60 miles of road between paving and chip sealing. And if community crossings goes away from us, that number's going to drop significantly. So that will hurt us bad.
So I think there's enough consensus that if you can give us some options for this, that would be helpful.
Is there anything other than the 2.5 million for the bridge? Is there anything else that you want me to include in there? Get to 5 million or?
I think there's going to be enough discussion about the other items on here that we probably can't say yes or no right now. We are definitely moving forward to decide if the YOC reopening is feasible financially. And if we do decide, we will have to fund it somehow through opioid or something else. The other two items on here, I think, will be up for quite a lot of discussion before we ask you to come back with options for us. What is it? Would you guys agree with that?
I'd say the road stuff is far more critical because when you start closing roads, you create a lot more of a hassle than anybody wants to have to deal with. And if these things start failing, and if we don't address them and they fail when somebody drives over them, then the county is liable for more than just fixing a culvert or bridge.
Is that part of our discussion this afternoon, Chad? Is maybe starting with these 4 on the sheet we were just given yesterday?
Yes, I think there's going to be a lot of discussions on that and several other things this afternoon.
Want to include the meeting we had?
Yes, we're going to have to.
Yes, there was another meeting we had that's going to be very critical too. So
What do you want me to hold off? I mean, I'm happy to do whatever. I just want to try to be efficient. I can hold off and do, because I can do the 2.5 million by itself. And then if you have more projects, we can.
You're not going to start on them today, Jason. So
Yeah.
let's, myself, Steve, someone will, Debbie, one of us will send you an email this afternoon and say, hey, this is kind of where everybody, because we're just in work session. We're not going to make any decisions. This is just the thought patterns. We'll send you, hey, this is the rundown of the thought patterns of the council and commissioners. And, you can kind of, I'm assuming it's going to be several options
Mhm.
to look at. And, that way you're not, if you don't mind, let's just send you an email later today or tomorrow. And that way you guys will send you a page email and you guys will have a idea of what we discussed this afternoon.
Okay.
I'll be shocked if it's not closer to 5 million.
Yeah,
From what I'm
gonna
hearing.
guess it's going to be close to that. So anybody have anything else for Paige or Jason before we let them go? We really appreciate your time and all of your guys' assistance. It's been invaluable as a council member, I can tell you that. Appreciate everything, and you'll hear from one of us later today, okay?
Thanks.
So the plan is to kind of break for lunch. Then we're gonna come back, 1 o'clock, an hour lunch work for everybody? I gotta run over to an RDC meeting. But is that work? An hour, Debbie, is that okay? Okay. Is that? Okay, 1:15.